How's it going, guys? Bryce here again, and this is part 2 of my React app tutorial. And just before we get started here, I just wanted to mention that we're going to be making our app a weather app. And I know this isn't all that interesting, but it will allow us to do some basic database work, request data from a free weather API, render it all through a React front end that we will deploy to be public. So I think seeing the essential components of this app should at least be enough to get you started on your own project, making your own idea. So let's get into it. Oh, and if we look to the left-hand toolbar here, we can see this little icon with a number, and this is our source control area. So if we go in here, we can actually see the list of files where we have made modifications, and this is tied in to the Git that's installed on our local machine. So now we're going to commit these changes, meaning that we're accepting these changes and moving forward. So let's do that now. So we type in a message that goes with a commit. We'll just call it initial commit. And then hit the little check mark button, and the changes will be committed. Perfect. Okay, so let's get into writing some backend code. There's another package we need to install for our app that we forgot to install in the first part of the tutorial. So we'll go to our command line and type npm install body parser -- save and hit enter. This is just a package that will be used alongside some of our HTTP interactions between our front end and our back end. Okay, perfect. We have that. Now let's go over to the left side where our project files are, and if we right click and make a new folder, let's call that server, and in that folder we want to make a new file called index.js. So this is going to be our root server file. So to start, the first thing we need to do is import the packages we want to use. So const path just going to type these out, and then we'll talk a little bit about what they are. Express and body parser. So the first one, path, is just a Node.js native module for doing different operations with file paths, opening up different things. We'll see how we're going to use that. The next one is Express, which is the backend server framework that we'll be using. And the last one is body parser, which we just installed, and like I said, it's for doing various HTTP interpretations of data that we send back and forth between our front end and our back end. So moving on, we need to also include some other constants that we want to be using. Process.env.node.env and port. And essentially what these constants are, the one is provided by the Node environment, and that's going to give us information about if we're working in development or production, and then we can use that information to make certain changes in our backend process. And the last one is the port, which is actually which port that our Express server will be running on. And this little OR symbol, you're used to that, seeing that in different logical contexts. Basically what this means is if the process is provided with a port, then use that port number. But if not, then use port 5000. So not too much to worry about for now. That kind of comes into play during the deployment phase. So let's move on. So next we need to initialize Express and register the basic middleware that we'll be using. app.use express JSON. Perfect. And now we need to add some code to make Express responsive to requests. So the way this works is essentially having Express listen on a port of our server, and when a request is made to the server on this specific port, then the Express middleware we will write will handle the requests and respond. So we do that by doing app.listen with our port constant, and then a callback just to show that we're listening on a port. So we can say to the console log server listening on port just need to change these to backticks instead of quotes. Perfect. And finally, we need to export this app variable from our file so it can be run via a command. So we do that by doing module.exports equals app. Perfect. You've just written your first Express backend. Congratulations. And if we go to our terminal, we just have to save this. Can do Control S. If we go to our terminal and we type the command node server / index.js, we can see that our backend is running. It says server listening on port 5000, just like we instructed it to. So that's great. But the only thing is, we don't want to write this command every time that we want to run our server. So we're going to enter a npm script to start the server for development. So if we go back to our package.json file and we go to that scripts area, we could just get rid of this test one that's in here. It's not really doing anything useful. And we make a script called server, and we make the command within it nodemon server. This will start our index.js file that we just wrote automatically when we enter this command. So the way this looks, just do Control C to exit the server that was already running. And if we type in our command npm run server, this is going to trigger the script that we just wrote up here to run the command nodemon server. And all nodemon essentially is a backend tool that will keep the server running for development. So even if we made a change to our index.js file, the server would still run. So we can see that it started down here after I entered that command. So if we go back to our index.js file and make a change to our file, let's say just change the text in that message, change it from these ellipses here to a exclamation mark. And if I do Control S to save, we can see down here that nodemon restarted, and it started the server again and made the change. So this is pretty handy when we're in the process of still writing our code, so that we don't have to be constantly Control C to kill the process. It'll just refresh for us, and that's great. So next, we're going to create our database connection, and we're going to do this by writing a class to wrap around our Postgres Node.js client that we downloaded earlier. So let's go to the left-hand side again, and under server, we'll make a new folder called database. And in that folder, we'll create a file called index.js. And the reason you've seen me naming files index.js is because it allows you to specify just the folder name if you want to import something. So say in this case, if we wanted to import our database, we could write something like this, just from /database without having to do database/index.js, because automatically when you specify like a folder name and you don't specify a JavaScript file to look for, it'll automatically look for index.js. So it's just a bit of a convenience thing, and it makes our code a little bit more simple. So just get rid of that. And this file is a bit complicated, so I'm probably just going to cut and paste the snippets of code, and I'll explain them as I go. And if you're following along, then you can just copy them down. And as always, if you want to find the source code, I'll have the link in the description for the GitHub repo, so you can copy and paste it if you don't feel like writing it out piece by piece. Okay, so first we'll need to import pool from our Postgres client. And this will be the interface that we'll be using to interact with a Postgres instance that's installed on our server, whether local or when we deploy our app to Heroku. So now we'll write our class and methods. I'm just going to copy and paste this. And if you haven't seen any object-oriented programming before, just think of this class as a particular object called database, and we can call the methods within it when we need them. So if we wanted to query, we would call database.query, and that would run that code. Then we just want to export the class so it can be used when it's imported into other files. So module.exports is equal to new database. So that means that we'll actually be returning a new instance of this class. So if we imported it as a variable called database, we would just do database.query if we wanted to do that. Easy peasy. Now let's open up Postgres and actually create our database locally. So pgadmin is this visual interface for managing our databases. So I'll show you how to do it in here, but this could be done via the command line too by just typing in a SQL command in the right place. So if we expand servers, it should be called something, your local Postgres instance should be called something like this. And we go to databases, and if we left click and click create database, create a new database, and we will call it weather-db, and click save, and that's been made for us. So now if we right click on WeatherDB and pick the query tool, we can query this new database. So we're going to start by creating a table called cities. So if you're not too familiar with SQL, don't worry about this too much for now, but essentially we're going to be creating a table that has a column called ID, which is a serial type. This is just like a numerical ID. And then if we may have another column called city name, type character. This basically just means it's going to be a string. Character varying 50. We won't allow it to be null. And we set our primary key to be ID. This means that the ID column basically identifies uniquely a city within our table of cities. So we just execute this command using the little lightning bolt here. There we go, and we've created our table. It's just a very simple table. It's just going to essentially hold city names, which we'll be using in our weather app. And let's go back to our database class, and we need to add some new constants. So the first one is a constant called connection string. I know it's kind of long, but just to walk through it, essentially what's going on here is once again we have this OR symbol. So basically this means if the process is passed a variable called database URL, use that. But if not, then use this string here, and this just connects to our localhost Postgres instance and our weather database. And also we're going to need another variable, another constant called SSL, and this will be set to process node end if this is equal to production. So this is the comparison logical equals. So if the environment that we're in is equal to production, this will evaluate to be true. If we're in development or anything else, then it will evaluate to false. So the reason for doing this is in the case of the connection string, when we deploy our app to Heroku, Heroku will actually set this database URL component because it needs to connect to a database that's running in their environment. But when we're in our development environment on our own machine, we want to connect to our local database using this connection string here. So that's great. Now we need to fill in our database methods. I'm going to just quickly copy and paste the code. Bear with me. So this is for our constructor. This is for our query method. And lastly, this is for our end method. So I'll just kind of explain what's going on here. So first of all, in the constructor, this is called when we create our new database object, which we did down here in the export. So that means this will happen whenever we import our database into another file to be used. So we create a pool, and we pass in that connection string as well as the SSL settings. And then we have some error handling right here. This is just for the pool, so it just means that if there's any sort of error connecting, that there will be a message log to the console to tell us that, and it will exit the process, killing our connection to our database. Then in our query method, we have the connect method inside of the our pool variable that we have set up here. And essentially what that means is we're going to connect, and within that connection we're going to call the query method on the client. So this is just if we have made a successful Postgres connection to our database, we can call this query method that's presented by the client, and we pass in our actual string query, whatever parameters that go along with that, and then we have a callback that's executed, and we handle if there's any errors, and if there aren't any errors, then we return the rows from our database through a callback back to whatever is calling our query method for our database, so that the data can be used in whatever context that is. And then finally we just have this end method down here, which we call after we're done using a database connection, and it just ends the pool. Great, so let's go back to our main server file here. Oh, let's make sure we save that first. Let's go back to our main server file, and we're going to now import our database class. So require, and whenever you're importing a module that you've written yourself, you can't just call it by name, you have to include the path. So we go from the current thing to our current directory to the database directory, and this will import our module that we just wrote. And now we'll just use our query method to basically get the current date and time from our local Postgres server, log the result to the console, just to make sure it works. So we'll go down here. Actually, we'll do it after we start listening. So select now is the query, and then as the callback method, so if there is an error, we want to return that error message and log it to the console. And if not, we just want to console log, say PostgreSQL is connected, and we take the first row of the rows that are returned to us, and we select the now column, and that'll be our timestamp. Just put a period after that, and save. I still have this running. Now we're getting a little error here. Oh, I know what it is. It's we forgot to pass our parameters into our method. So there we go. That should fix things. Save. And there we are. It says down here that we're connected, and we know it works. Yeah, that's the problem with copy and pasting the code in. You're not always paying attention to what you're doing. Perfect. So congrats, you've successfully connected your backend to your database, and now we can write queries to push and retrieve data. Now that we can connect, we need to set up some functionality to query our database according to how we actually need to use it. So let's start making a new folder in our server folder, and we'll call it models. And within that, let's make a new file called cities.js. We need to start by requiring our database class. Require ... So we have to do the 2 dots means the parent directory, since we're down in the models directory, so we have to go up 1 level to get to the database folder, and we'll be able to import our class. And then we're going to create a cities class, and this will have some methods that we will use to query our database. So we're going to have a couple of methods in here, one called retrieve all, just do the skeletons for now, and another one called insert. And once again, as always, we need to export our class so that it can be imported into other files. So we do module.exports equal cities. So for the retrieve all method, we're just going to use a simple select query to get the list of cities that are stored in the cities table in our database. So our first argument will be callback. So this will be a function that's passed in to this function that will basically be passed the result from our database, which will use that result somewhere else. So if we do db.query and we make our query select city underscore name from cities, and we create a callback here. If there's an error, again, we're going to pass the error to our callback, but if not, then we're going to pass the results to our callback, which is the resulting rows. So just in case you're unfamiliar, I keep tossing around this term callbacks. JavaScript is popular for using these callbacks, and essentially what that means is you pass a function to another function. So in this case, this callback is a function, and when something happens, we're going to want to execute this function that we pass to then utilize whatever result we got from our database. It's a little bit confusing, but I will summarize as we get further along just to make sure it's clear what's happening. And if you want to learn more, you can do some reading on JavaScript callback functions. There's a lot of documentation out there and plenty of examples for it to make more sense. Next, for the insert method, we're going to pass another parameter in this time, so city, and then callback once again like before. And this time we'll be using an insert query, which will add a new city to our table of cities in our database. So if we do db.query insert into cities, and then in brackets city name values, and then in brackets $1, and then we need to pass this parameter, so the value of city, the string that gets passed in, will be mapped to this $1 here. It's just a secure way of writing something like prepared queries. And then we'll do a callback, error and res, and within this callback, we will check again for an error. If there's an error, we want to return it to our callback, and if not, then we want to return our resulting rows. For an insert query, there isn't really, I think it's an empty set that's returned, so it's not really going to be used for anything, but that's just the way we designed the setup. Great, so now we have created our model for interacting with cities stored in our database. And now that we can connect and retrieve or insert data using this model, we have to set up an API endpoint that will allow us to send and retrieve data from our front end to our back end. So if we go to the left-hand side and right-click once again and create a new folder inside of our server folder, and we'll call that API. And within that folder, we make a new file called cities.js. So to start, we're going to need to import Express. Also, we need to import our cities model since we'll be using it here. So var express equals require express. And as before, when you're importing a module that you wrote yourself, you have to include the path. So we're going to go ... which means to go to the parent directory, go under models and cities. Perfect. And now we're going to create an express router. So var router is equal to express.router. So this is essentially a module that handles all the middleware for a particular part of our backend. So in this case, it's our cities data. We can define specific handling for HTTP methods using this mechanism. So let's get started by defining the get method on this router. So to do that, let's call the get method on our router object that we just created. We put in a path to begin with, and then a callback function that has the request and also the response as arguments. So within here, we're actually going to use our cities model. So we're going to call the retrieve all method that we set up, and we have to pass to that a callback function like we mentioned before. So that callback has two arguments, error and cities. And so within this function, if we find an error, we want to return and also call on the response that Express provides to send JSON data, and we'll send that error as JSON data. And in any other case, assuming everything goes well, we will call the JSON method again on the response, but pass our cities list. So this is a bit confusing. We have some nested functions inside of functions, but this is the basic mechanism of Express middleware. We have a request object and we have a response object. So we use the request object to get more information, usually. Not in this case because it's just retrieving all the cities. There's no input parameter required. But then we're going to return our data to the front end using this response. So the cities data is returned in this callback method, and it contains everything we're going to need in our front end. So a list of strings that represent the names of the cities. Great. So now we have an API endpoint, and if we make a GET request to this particular router, we will get back our list of cities. Now we're going to need another mechanism to set up the functionality to add a new city to our list. So this will be inserted into our cities table in our database, and in this case we're going to be using the post HTTP method. So to create a handler for that, we do router.post applied to the root of our path, and then we use the same callback function structure again, so request and response. And this time we're going to actually be passing in the name of the city that we want to insert. So that's going to be in the body of the request. So we can retrieve that city by calling request.body, and then within that body, which is essentially a JSON object, we take the city attribute. So we capture that in a variable, and then we're going to use our method, or our insert method from our model, and we're going to pass in that city name, and then also providing a callback so that we know what to do with the results from our database. Once again, if there's an error, we want to return that error in JSON data in our response to our front end. And if not, assuming everything goes well, we want to return our result as JSON data back to our front end. So there we have it. This looks pretty similar to our get method that we defined before, but the difference is, again, we're using post. So even though we're on the same path here, they don't get overlapped because there's two different HTTP methods being used here. So essentially post is used when you're sending data to the server, in short, and get is when you want to retrieve data from the server, as we did before. If you want to read more about that, you can study up on HTTP. It's pretty interesting stuff, and obviously a really core component of web development. But that's great. We have created our router for our cities API endpoint. The last thing we need to do is just export the router so that it can be used in our main server file when we're ready to initialize it. So let's do that now. So let's go back to our main index.js file for our server, and we need to first import the express router that we just exported so that we have access to our API endpoint. So if we make some space here, we want to essentially register our API middleware that we just created. So if we go app.use, and then we define a path that we will have to use to interact with our API. And then if we require / in our current directory, we go to the API folder and then access the cities module. Great. So now when we call HTTP GET on this API endpoint, then we will retrieve the set of cities like we defined before. And if we call POST and pass in a new city name, the model that we defined in our API endpoint will see that that new city is added to our database. So this is great. Now let's test this and make sure it's working as it should. So what we're going to do is we're going to open up a new browser window. Let me just put things to the side here. And we need to make sure our server is running. So once again, we'll do npm run server in our command line. Perfect. So everything is connected, including to our database. So if we enter in our address bar, we're going to try doing a GET request. A GET request is going to happen when we type in a URL and press enter. So if we type localhost, see it's running on port 5000, and we search API/cities, we see that the JSON that's returned is a empty array. Just it's pretty small up here in the corner. And this makes sense because we haven't added any new cities to our database yet. So we're connected, we're interacting with the API, everything seems to be working. Fantastic. Congratulations, you've set it up so that we can retrieve and push data through our API endpoint. So our backend is already starting to look pretty complete. We've initialized the backend process, we made a connection to our database, we set up an API endpoint that connects with a model that lets us draw data or insert data into our database. So next we need to get access to our free weather API and set up a mechanism to download the weather data. So we're going to use OpenWeatherMap, which is a free API, and it will give us enough features that will be suitable for our app. So we're on the API page here. So what you'll want to do is you'll want to sign up and sign in and also get yourself an API key. You're going to need that. Whenever you make a request to an API, it's pretty customary that you provide a key so that not just anybody is pulling data from an API at a unregulated pace. So once you get there, sign in, go to the API keys tab, and copy and paste your API key into a safe place, and we'll be using it in our code soon. So returning to our project, we can just expand Visual Studio Code again. If we do Control-C to terminate the server, there's another server-side package that we'll need to use in the new model that we're going to be creating. So we'll install that real quick. So if we run npm install request and request -promise --save. So these are two libraries, and they essentially will just aid us in the process of making HTTP requests to the API, which will send us back some JSON data which we will then use in our app. So let's go to our models folder and create a new file called weather.js. So the first thing we'll need to do is import the request library that we just installed. So if we do require request promise, we'll have access to that. And now we're also going to want to make a constant that will hold our API key for us. So just make the constant called API underscore key, and then I'll copy and paste mine in. You won't be able to see it because I shouldn't be sharing that with anybody, just as you shouldn't be sharing yours with anybody either. Perfect. So now we'll create the class for our model. So call the class weather, and inside of our class we'll have one method called retrieve by city, and that'll take a parameter for the city name and also a callback. So in case it hasn't been clear so far, the reason I separate the data access into an API file and a model file is to keep some clear logical boundaries for moving data. So at the root, our backend runs in our main index.js file. Then we register an API endpoint, which can be reached with a URL, and then the API endpoint then uses a model that we define, as we do with this class here, that will actually get the data, whether from a database or making an HTTP request to like an API endpoint like we're about to do. It obviously does not need to be done this way, but I think the clear separation is helpful for debugging and also processing the data effectively if you need to make any manipulations or anything of that sort. And next, as always, we want to export our class so it can be imported into other files. Moving on, we need to actually use the request promise package to call the OpenWeatherMap API and get the weather. So let's fill out the basic setup of a request. So using this request module that we imported, we're going to pass a object which will have some options. They're going to contain information about what type of request we're making. So you can see like we're making a request that will return JSON format, and also we'll present a URI, which is the actual endpoint where the data will be being extracted from. And then we can chain on another method called then, and this then function receives a callback, and this callback, it will return the data once it's been received in this response variable. So from here we're going to want to pass that to the callback function here. And I know this is confusing, we're moving data around quite a bit, but the passing it from where we actually receive the data from the API to our backend in Express, we can actually do something with this data. So try not to get too caught up in the details of how that works. Just know that this callback that we passed in is kind of like the link between our Express backend and the actual data result that's being returned from our API request. So after that, we also have a catch method that we chain, and this also receives a function. And this function is really just to handle any cases where we have problems connecting to the OpenWeatherMap API or anything of that sort. So we'll console log the error if we have one. Also, we're going to return the error in JSON format to our backend. So just enter a string message here that says could not reach OpenWeatherMap API. Perfect. Lastly, let's fill in the URL that we'll be retrieving the data from. So I'm just going to copy and paste this longish URL into the URI property, and I'll explain what's going on. Here we go. So the address is api.openweathermap.org, and there's some different arguments here. It's just saying that we're calling the weather API from this location, and we're passing a few parameters into this URL. So the city, which is past the city name as a string, we will insert into the string right here, and also our app ID, which is just corresponds to our API key, and that gets passed in as well. And also just specifying that the units, we want them to be imperial. That was purely just a choice on my part. If you go to the API reference on the internet, then you will find that there will be all kinds of different options where you can specify, and those are really subjective. It's whatever you want. This is just what we've chosen for this tutorial. Fantastic. So we have our weather model completely set up. Next, as we did before, we have to set up the corresponding API endpoint for the weather model we just made. So let's go to the left-hand side again, go under the API folder, and make a new file called weather.js. And as before, we need to import a few different files that we'll be needing. So we'll import Express once again, require Express, and we'll import our weather model. Going to the parent directory, going to models, and then selecting weather. And once again, we need to initialize a new router. Express.router. Now we're going to write a get method for our router that takes a city parameter in the path. So once again, we use our router that we just defined. Use the get method, and then define the path with a parameter of city. Once again, using the function with the request and response as arguments. And this time we can capture the city that's passed in to the parameter by using the request object, the params object, and then the city attribute. So we can pull that right out of the URL and then use it within our function. So now if we call our weather model and the retrieve by city method, we pass in that city as an argument, and we also have our callback, which provides the error as well as the weather data that's returned from the OpenWeatherMap API. So if there's an error, as before, we want to return the response using the JSON method to show that it's JSON data, pass that error. But if not, assuming everything goes well, we want to return the response in JSON data with the weather object. And lastly, as before, we need to export our router so it can be imported into our main file and incorporated into our Express app. So as usual, module.exports is equal to router. So finally, like we had to with our cities model and API, we just now have to register this API endpoint in our Express app. So let's switch back to our main index.js file, and right underneath where we included our cities model, let's app.use the middleware that we just defined with the router, API/weather. And once again, we'll require the router that we just exported. The current folder, go to the API directory and get the weather component. And there we have it. So if we save that and make sure our server is running, go down to the command line again and type in npm run server. We can test just to make sure our API is working and connected properly. So if we put this to the side here, we go to our browser window and we type in localhost, once again on port 5000, API/weather/Toronto. Notice how we're passing in the city name right in the URL, Toronto. Press enter, and there we have it. It's a little messy right now, but this is essentially JSON data corresponding to the current weather in Toronto. So that's great. That's exactly what we were expecting. And in another part of the tutorial, we'll be covering how we can render this data into something meaningful in our user interface. So lastly, let's go back to Visual Studio, and since we've completed this part of the tutorial, we're going to commit our changes. So if we go to our source control tab again, Let's add a message of added backend code and commit our changes. Then we're done. That's great. Congratulations, you've finished your backend. We now have a connection to a database, useful API endpoints, and the ability to send and receive data from the server. So stay tuned, because next we will be building our React front end. Thanks for watching, and if you've enjoyed this video or enjoyed this tutorial in general, please subscribe. Have a good day.